Chapter 5. The Journey from Platform 9 and 3/4. Violet and Harry's last month with the Dursleys wasn't exactly fun, but it was a vast improvement to every single month spent previously with them. Dudley was now so scared of them he wouldn't stay in the same room, while Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon didn't shut them in their cupboard, force them to do anything, or shout at them. In fact, they didn't speak to the twins at all. Half terrified, half furious, they acted as if any space occupied by Harry or Violet was empty. Although this was an improvement in many ways, it did become a bit depressing after a while. The twins kept to their room with their new pets for company. Violet's cat was called Crookshanks by the lady in the shop, who said he'd been there for years and years because no one had wanted him. Violet didn't care for the name and had been trying out new ones. The great ginger cat didn't seem to care what she called him. He just sat there and stared at her and would occasionally come over to her if she extended a hand. Mostly, he just liked to sleep on her stomach and make little grumbly noises if she tried to move him. Harry had named his owl Hedwig, a name he'd found in a history of magic. Their school books were very interesting. While Harry was content to merely skim through them and read any interesting bits that caught his attention, Violet had already worked through several from cover to cover and taken notes along the way, just like she'd been taught in primary school. Harry had told her the rest of what the boy in the robe shop had said and confessed to feeling stupid for not understanding a word of it. Violet didn't like to feel stupid. She wanted to know what was going on and what it all meant, so that no one could question whether or not she belonged in the newly revealed wizarding world. Each night before they went to sleep, she would tick off another day on the piece of paper Harry had pinned to the wall, counting down to September 1st. On the last day of August, the twins drew lots to decide who would go and ask Uncle Vernon for a ride to the train station the next day. Harry lost. Violet waited anxiously at the top of the stairs, expecting lots of yelling and perhaps even the sound of something being smashed. Instead, there was only quiet mumbling from below. It was a pleasant surprise then when Harry reappeared, smiling, and gave her 2 thumbs up. Harry woke Violet up at 5 o'clock the next morning, too excited to contain himself, and neither of them could get back to sleep. They got up and got dressed into some normal clothes. Violet talked her brother into changing on the train. She checked her Hogwarts list again to make sure they both had everything they needed, saw that Hedwig and Crookshanks, whom Violet was trying to call Frasier to no avail, tucked into their cages, and then paced the room, waiting for the Dursleys to get up. 2 hours later, their huge, heavy trunks had been loaded into the Dursleys' car. Aunt Petunia had talked Dudley into sitting in back with the twins, and they had set off. They reached King's Cross at 10:30. Uncle Vernon dumped their trunks each onto their own cart and even wheeled Violet's into the station for her. Violet thought this was strangely kind until Uncle Vernon stopped dead, facing the platforms with a nasty grin on his face. "Well, there you are, boy," he said. "Look at Harry. Platform 9, Platform 10. Your platform should be somewhere in the middle, but they don't seem to have built it yet, do they?" Violet looked down at her ticket and frowned. It was printed right there, Platform 934, but Uncle Vernon was quite right. There was a big plastic number 9 over one platform and a big plastic 10 over the one next to it, and in the middle, nothing at all. "Aunt Petunia," Violet said, "where was the platform when you came with our mother?" Aunt Petunia stared at Violet as though she'd just grown a second nose. Violet had almost never asked her aunt about their mother before, but they were sisters once. And if Aunt Petunia had remembered their mother getting her Hogwarts letter all those years ago then, she must have also remembered dropping off or picking her sister up from the train station. "In between," Aunt Petunia said, and Uncle Vernon looked at her in shock. Aunt Petunia looked quite shocked herself. "It was years ago, and I never understood, but she used to walk somewhere in the middle, and then she'd be gone. She'd never explain it to me either, no matter how many times I asked." Aunt Petunia closed her mouth suddenly. Her thin lips pursed into an even thinner line to the point where they nearly vanished. Uncle Vernon shook his head and took her firmly by the elbow. "That's enough," he growled. "Absolutely enough of this nonsense. Get in the car, Petunia, and you too." He squinted nastily at the twins, each one of them in turn. Whatever he had meant to say, he appeared to decide against it. Uncle Vernon let out an angry grunt and stomped off back toward the car, Aunt Petunia still firmly in his grip. Violet put both hands on the handle of her cart and turned to Harry. "Come on," she said, and put on her bravest smile. "Let's see if someone else comes along, and we can follow them." It didn't take long for an opportunity to present itself. They had 10 minutes before the train for Hogwarts was meant to leave when Harry spotted a family entering the station. There was a plump woman talking to 4 boys and leading a small girl by the hand, all with flaming red hair. The boys were each pushing a trunk like Harry's and Violet's in front of them, and they had Annal. Sticking close to one another, Violet and Harry wheeled their carts toward them and watched to see where they went. What looked like the oldest boy marched toward platforms 9 and 10. Violet watched, careful not to blink in case she missed it, but just as the boy reached the dividing barrier between the 2 platforms, a large crowd of tourists came swarming in front of them, and by the time the last backpack had cleared away, the boy had vanished. "Fred, you next," the plump woman said. "I'm not Fred, I'm George," said the boy. "Honestly, woman, you call yourself our mother." "Sorry, George, dear. Only joking. I am Fred," said the boy, and off he went. His twin, as Violet realized with delight, called after him to hurry up, and he must have done so, because a second later he had gone. But how had he done it? Now the third brother was walking briskly toward the barrier. He was almost there, and then, quite suddenly, he wasn't anywhere. Violet was sure she must be missing something and turned to her brother to ask if he'd seen any different, but Harry was already walking forward with his mouth open. "Excuse me," Harry said to the plump woman. "Hello, dears," she said. "First time at Hogwarts." Ron's new too. She pointed at the last and youngest of her sons. He was tall, thin, and gangling, with freckles, big hands and feet, and a long nose. "Yes," said Harry. The thing is, we don't know how to get onto the platform," the woman said kindly, and both Harry and Violet nodded. "Not to worry," she said. "All you have to do is walk straight at the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Don't stop and don't be scared you'll crash into it. That's very important. Best do it at a bit of a run if you're nervous. Go on, go now before Ron." Harry looked at Violet and Violet looked at Harry, and she nodded at once for him to go ahead. He was the brave one, and if he could do it first, then she would know it was all right. That was how things usually worked between them. Harry pushed his trolley around and stared at the barrier. It looked very solid. Violet watched with her eyes as wide as she could make them, not wanting to miss a single moment in case something went wrong. Harry started to walk toward the barrier, then moved more quickly until he had broken into a run toward the barrier, and oh, no, he wouldn't be able to stop. The cart was out of control. He was going to crash. Only he didn't. Violet blinked rapidly at the place where her brother had once been and was no longer. He had simply disappeared through the barrier, gone in between, just like Aunt Petunia had said. "See, dear," said the plump woman from behind Violet, smiling encouragingly. "Nothing to it. Go on then, your turn. Ron and I will be just behind you." "Thank you for helping us," Violet said sincerely, and positioned her cart in front of the barrier. Unlike Harry, she started at a brisk pace and maintained it, heart hammering in her chest as she drew nearer and nearer to the barrier. It looked completely impenetrable, yet she had just seen her brother walk straight, though unharmed. It could be done. She could do it. And do it she did, with eyes wide open, and passed through a solid wall without feeling it at all. The first thing she saw was Harry, standing some feet away, his face lit up with excitement and wonder. Then she saw the scarlet steam engine and the whole platform packed with people, and the sign overhead which read Hogwarts Express, 11 o'clock. They had made it. "Can you believe it?" Harry asked, barely glancing at her as she approached, his attention so split by everything going on around them. "Look at all these people. Are they really all like us?" I didn't expect so many, said Violet, feeling suddenly nervous about the crowd. Diagon Alley had been rather busy during their visit, but this felt different somehow. Smoke drifted over the heads of the chattering crowd, while cats of every color wound here and there between their legs. Violet suddenly pitied Crookshanks, confined to his cage. She would be sure to let him out on the train. The first few carries were already packed with students, some hanging out of the windows to talk to their families, some fighting over seats. The twins pushed their carts down the platform in search of empty seats. They passed a round-faced boy who was saying, "Gran, I've lost my toad again." "Oh, Neville," Violet heard the old woman sigh. A boy with dreadlocks was surrounded by a small crowd. "Give us a look, Lee, go on." The boy lifted the lid of the box in his arms, and the people around him shrieked and yelled as something inside poked out a long, hairy leg. Violet and Harry pressed on through the crowd until they found an empty compartment near the end of the train. They put the pets inside first, and then started shoving and heaving their trunks toward the train door. Even with the two of them both lifting, they couldn't quite get even a single trunk up the steps. "Want a hand?" It was one of the red-headed twins they'd followed through the barrier. "Yes, please," Violet panted. "Oi, Fred, see me and help." With the other twins' help, Harry's trunk was tucked away in a corner of the compartment, shortly followed by Violet's. By the end, they were all panting from the effort. "Thanks," said Harry, pushing his sweaty hair out of his eyes. "What's that?" said one of the red-headed twins suddenly, pointing at Harry's lightning scar. "Blimey," said the other twin. "Are you highs?" said the first twin. His eyes flicked to Violet. "Socias, what?" said Harry. "The Potters," chorused the boys. Violet felt her face getting very red. She ducked her head down, wishing her hair was untied so that it could fall and cover her face. "Oh," said Harry. Yeah, we are." The two boys were gawking, and Violet hated being gawked at more than anything. To her immense relief, a voice came floating through the train's open door. "Fred." "George, are you there?" "Coming, Mum." With a last look at Harry, the twin boys hopped off the train. Violet hurriedly sat down on the far side of the compartment, hoping no one else would be able to see her. Harry, however, sat himself underneath the window and was trying to spy on the family. "How could they just know us like that?" Violet asked, still mortified, but Harry only shushed her so that he could listen in on the conversation taking place outside. Violet sank down in her seat and sulked. Then she remembered the cat and quickly got up again. "Fracia," she called when the door to the cage was opened. A pair of narrowed yellow eyes stared back at her from within, unblinking and unmoving. She pursed her lips and tried again. "Crookshanks, would you like to come out?" Slowly, and after a long moment to let her know that it was his own idea, the immense and fluffy orange form of Crookshanks emerged from his crate and allowed himself to be lifted and placed into the seat beside Violet. He began to purr immediately when she placed a hand on his back. Eventually, finally, the train began to move. Harry watched out the window all the while, staring back at the platform they just left and smiling wider than Violet had seen in ages. Houses flashed past out the window, and the subtle rocking of the train as it picked up speed filled Violet's stomach with a gentle buzz of excitement. She didn't know where they were going to, but it had to be better than what they were leaving behind. The door of the compartment slid open, and the youngest red-headed boy came in. "Anyone sitting there?" he asked, pointing at the seat opposite Harry. "Everywhere else is full." Harry and Violet shook their heads, and the boy sat down. He glanced between them and then looked quickly out of the window, pretending he hadn't looked. "Hey, Ron." The twins were back. "Listen, we're going down the middle of the train. Lee Jordan's got a giant tarantula down there." "Right," mumbled Ron. "Harry, right." "And Violet," said the other twin. "Did we introduce ourselves? Fred and George Weasley, and this is Ron, our brother. See you later, then." "Bye," said Harry and Ron, and Violet gave a little wave. The other twins slid the compartment door shut behind them. "Are you really the Potter twins?" Ron blurted out. Violet's face flushed red again as Harry nodded. "Oh, well, I thought it might be one of Fred and George's jokes," said Ron. "And have you really got you know?" He pointed to Harry's forehead. Harry pulled back his bangs to show the lightning scar. Ron stared. How does everybody know about his scar? Violet asked. Well, isn't that where you know who? Yes, said Harry, but I can't remember it. Nothing, Ron said eagerly. We were babies, Violet said crisply. How could we remember? Oh, said Ron. His ears went pink. Right, sorry. He sat and stared at Harry for a few moments, then, as though he had suddenly realized what he was doing, he looked quickly out of the window again. Are all your family wizards? Asked Harry, who seemed to be just as interested in Ron as Ron was in them. Yes, I think so, said Ron. I think Mum's got a second cousin who's an accountant, but we never talk about him. Do you knows loads of magic already? Asked Violet, realizing what an opportunity this boy presented. Someone who had grown up in a wizarding family would be able to tell them all sorts of things that they ought to have known already, and he seemed like a nice enough boy. Hopefully, he wouldn't make fun of them for asking. I heard you went to live with muggles, said Ron. What they like? Horrible, said Harry immediately. Well, not all of them. Our aunt and uncle and cousin are, though. Would have been nice to grow up with wizards. We've got plenty of them in my house, Ron grumbled. I'm the sixth in our family to go to Hogwarts. You could say I've got a lot to live up to. Bill and Charlie have already left. Bill was head boy, and Charlie was captain of Quidditch. Now Percy's a prefect. Fred and George mess around a lot, but they still get really good marks, and everyone thinks they're really funny. Everyone expects me to do as well as the others, but if I do, it's not big deal because they did it first. You never get anything new, either with 5 brothers. I've got Bill's old robes, Charlie's old wand, and Percy's old rat. Ron reached inside his jacket and pulled out a fat grey rat, which was asleep. His name's Scabbers, and he's useless. He hardly ever wakes up. Percy got an owl from Dad for being made a prefect, but they couldn't. Ron didn't get to finish telling them what his family couldn't do because at that moment, despite being calmly dozing in her lap only seconds before, Crookshanks lunged across the gap and pounced on the rat in Ron's lap. Crookshanks, no, Violet shouted, jumping up immediately to try and pull the cat away. Scabbers had woken up as well and was squeaking frantically, and Ron was hollering as Crookshanks' claws dug into his legs trying to get at the rodent. Get it off. Scabbers, the rat, managed to wriggle out of Crookshanks' grasp and flop to the floor, righting itself and scurrying to safety behind the stacked trunks. Crookshanks tried to chase it, but Violet caught him midair and wrapped both arms tightly around his middle. Bad cat, she scolded, holding the wriggling orange mass against her chest. That's not a toy, it's a friend. You can't eat somebody else's friend. Ron dropped to the floor and tried to coax his terrified rat out from behind the trunks. When that failed, he reached a long arm between the gap and pulled Scabbers out with one hand. Crookshanks let out a low, warning yowl. Keep that thing away from him, Ron squeaked, tucking Scabbers back within the safety of his pocket. Violet kept a firm hold on Crookshanks and glared at him. He's a cat. You can't go pulling out mice and rats in front of him and expect him not to react to it. Are you all right? Me. It's Scabbers that I'm bloody worried about. Ron peeped into his pocket. You all right, mate? Did that thing get you? Violet was about to object to her cat being called that thing, but Harry broke the tension in his usual way with a question. Tell us more about your family. Violet listened idly to Harry and Ron chatter on, trying to soothe Crookshanks and get him to go back to sleep. It was odd that he'd reacted that way to Scabbers. In the pet shop where she'd bought him, there had been plenty of small birds and rodents sitting about, and he hadn't so much as glanced at any of them. Perhaps those creatures had been in the shop just as long as he had, and had grown used to each other's company. He was in a new place now, with new people and new sights and smells. Violet couldn't blame him for getting riled up. And until Hagrid told us, we didn't know about being wizards or about our parents or Voldemort. Ron gasped so loudly that Violet jumped in her seat. What? Said Harry. You said you know whose name, said Ron, sounding both shocked and impressed. I'd have thought you all of people. I'm not trying to be brave or anything, saying the name, said Harry defensively. I just never knew you shouldn't. See what I mean? I've got loads to learn. I bet, he added, sounding suddenly gloomy, I bet I'm the worst in the class. You won't be, said Ron and Violet at the same time. They looked at each other with a small smile, and Ron continued. There's loads of people who come from Muggle families, and they learn quick enough. While they had been talking and dealing with their pets, the train had carried them out of London. Now they were speeding past fields full of cows and sheep. They were quiet for a time, watching the fields and lanes flick past. Around 12:30, there was a great clattering in the corridor, and a smiling, dimpled woman slid back their door and said, "Anything off the cart, dears?" Violet, who suddenly realized she hadn't eaten anything all day, was grateful when Harry leapt to his feet. Ron stayed where he was, his ears gone slightly pink, as he muttered that he'd brought sandwiches. Harry went out into the corridor and returned several minutes later with an armload of the oddest assortment of candies and treats that Violet had ever seen. He dumped it all into the seat between them, a pile of brightly colored wrappers for Drooble's best blowing gum, pumpkin pasties, licorice wands, chocolate frogs, Birdie Bart's every flavor beans. Violet had no idea what any of it was, and she planned to try all of it. "Hungry, are you?" Ron asked as the twins each grabbed a pack at random and tore into it. "Starving," they said in unison. Harry took a large bite out of a pumpkin pasty, and Violet had a mouthful of something called a cauldron cake. Ron had taken out a lumpy package and unwrapped it. There were 4 sandwiches inside. He pulled one of them apart and said, "She always forgets I don't like corned beef." "Swap you for one of these," said Violet, holding up a pasty. "Go on, you don't want this. It's all dry," said Ron. "She hasn't got much time," he added quickly. "You know, with 5 of us." "Our aunt always had plenty of time to do what she liked," Violet said, chucking a pasty to Ron before he could try to turn it down again, "mostly because she makes Harry and I do all the work, though. I don't think she's ever made either of us a sandwich before." Ron's mouth hung open as he processed that, but he closed it without saying anything more. He unwrapped the pasty and ate it graciously, along with everything else Harry and Violet passed him. "What are these?" Harry asked Ron, holding up a pack of chocolate frogs. "They're Natriolith frogs, are they?" "No," said Ron, "but see what the card is." "I'm missing Agrippa." "What?" "Oh, of course, you wouldn't know chocolate frogs have cards inside them, you know, to collect famous witches and wizards. I've got about 500, but I haven't got Agrippa or Ptolemy." Harry unwrapped his chocolate frog and picked up the card. Violet leaned over to read it too. It showed a man's face. He wore half-moon glasses, had a long, crooked nose, and flowing silver hair, beard, and mustache. Underneath the picture with the name Albus Dumbledore. "Sarthases Dumbledore," said Violet. "Don't tell me you'd never heard of Dumbledore," said Ron. "Can I have a frog?" "I might get Agrippa, thanks." When Harry had finished looking over his card, he handed it over to Violet, who read, "Albus Dumbledore, currently headmaster of Hogwarts, considered by many the greatest wizard of modern times. Dumbledore is particularly famous for his defeat of the dark wizard Grindelwald in 1945, for the discovery of the 12 uses of dragon's blood, and his work on alchemy with his partner, Nicholas Flamel. Professor Dumbledore enjoys chamber music and 10-pin bowling." Violet turned the card back over and saw, to her astonishment, that Dumbledore's face had disappeared. "He's gone." "Well, you can't expect him to hang around all day," said Ron. "He'll be back." "No, I've got Morgana again, and I've got about 6 of her. Do either of you want it? You could start collecting." Ron's eyes strayed to the pile of chocolate frogs waiting to be unwrapped. "Help yourself," said Harry. "But in, you know, the Muggle world, people just stay put in photos." "Do they?" "What, they don't move at all?" Ron sounded amazed. "Weird." Violet stared as Dumbledore sidled back into the picture on his card and gave her a small smile. Ron was more interested in eating the frogs than looking at the famous witches and wizards' cards, but Harry and Violet couldn't keep their eyes off them. They passed each card back and forth as they unwrapped them, and soon they had not only Dumbledore and Morgana, but Hengist of Woodcrast, Alberic Grunion, Circe, Paracelsus, and Merlin. Violet finally tore her eyes away from the druidess Cleardna, who was scratching her nose, to open a bag of Birdie Bart's every flavor beans. You want to be careful with those, Ron warned Violet. When they say every flavor, they mean every flavor, you know. You get all the ordinary ones like chocolate and peppermint and marmalade, but then you can get spinach and liver and tripe. George reckons he got a bogey-flavored one once. Ron picked up a green bean, looked at it carefully, and bit into a corner. Bleargsy, sprouts. They had a good time eating the every flavor beans. Violet got toast, coconut, baked bean, strawberry, curry, grass, coffee, and sardine, and even managed to dare Harry into nibbling the end of a funny grey one that Ron wouldn't touch, which turned out to be pepper. The countryside now flying past the window was becoming wilder. The neat fields had gone. Now there woods, twisting rivers, and dark green hills. There was a knock on the door of their compartment, and the round-faced boy the twins had passed on platform 9 3/4 came in. He looked tearful. "Sorry," he said, "but have you seen a toad at all?" When they all shook their heads, he wailed, "I've lost him. He keeps getting away from me." "He'll turn up," said Harry kindly. "Yes," said the boy miserably. "Well, if you see him." "Would you like help looking for him?" Violet asked, already getting to her feet. The boy's face went bright pink. Oh, I mean you don't have to. We can cover more ground together," said Violet, smiling encouragingly at the boy as she joined him in the hall. "Where have you looked already?" "The last 4 compartments," the boy said, looking mournfully down the train car. "Nobody's seen him, even as big as he is." "You really don't have to. There's another girl helping me look. She went off that way." The boy hadn't so much raised his arm to point when the compartment next door slid open, and another young girl stepped out into the hall. She had bushy brown hair, a very determined expression, and rather large front teeth. She was already wearing her new Hogwarts robes. "He hasn't come this way, Neville," she said, and then stopped at the sight of Violet. "Oh, hello, are you helping to look for Trevor as well?" "We've been going up and down the car asking everyone if they've seen a toad, and they've all said no. But I would think that someone must they've seen him coming hopping along down here, though I don't know why they wouldn't say anything about it. Not very helpful, if you ask me." "I'm happy to meet someone else willing to lend a hand. I'm Hermione Granger. By the way, who are you?" She said all this very fast. "Violet Potter," Violet said, and stuck out her hand politely. Hermione Granger's eyes went wide. "Are you really?" "I know all about you, and your brother, of course. I got a few extra books for background reading, and you're in modern magical history and rise and fall of the dark arts and great wizarding events of the 20th century. "Are we?" said Violet. "Goodness, didn't you know? I'd have found out everything I could if it was me," said Hermione. "Do you know what house you'll be in? I've been asking around, and I hope I'm in Gryffindor. It sounds by far the best. I hear Dumbledore himself was in it, but I suppose Ravenclaw wouldn't be too bad. Anyway, we'd better get back to looking to Neville's toad. You should double back and see if it's come through, and we can keep looking at this end of the car." And then she turned around and left, and the toadless boy wordlessly followed behind her. Violet was left alone in the corridor, swaying slightly with the momentum of the train and feeling very dazed. Suddenly, she no longer felt comfortable wandering the train, popping in on people and introducing herself. Ron knew about Harry's scar before he'd even seen it. If her name and story were in history books that anyone could just pick up and read, then what might people know about her? More than she knew about herself, apparently. Making sure that Neville and Hermione were out of sight, Violet opened the door to her compartment and quietly slipped back inside. "Did you find the toad?" Ron asked through a mouthful of bright pink chewing gum. "No," Violet said, maneuvering Crookshanks out of her seat, "but he's already got another girl helping him. I think they'll manage." Ron grunted through his gum. Harry was busy squinting at the list on the back of the Bertie Bart's box. "What houses are your brothers in?" asked Violet, suddenly curious. "Gryffindor," said Ron. Gloom seemed to settle over him again. "All of them. Mum and Dad were in it too. I don't know what they'll say if I'm not. Our family's always in the same house, Harry said. Ron shook his head. Not always. There's some wizarding families that make their houses a point of pride. But there's plenty that are just happy they got their letters at all, you know. I've got a few relatives that were in Hufflepuff, I think, and Dad's mum was in Ravenclaw. Can't imagine anyone in my family being in Slytherin, though. Imagine if they put me in there. That's the house Val, I mean, you know who was in. Yeah, said Ron. He flopped back into his seat, looking depressed. What do your oldest brothers do now that they've left Hogwarts, anyway? Violet asked, trying to take Ron's mind off houses. She regretted having brought it up at all. Charlie's in Romania studying dragons, and Bill's in Africa doing something for Gringotts, said Ron. Did you hear about Gringotts? It's been all over Thedley Prophet, but I don't suppose you get that with the Muggles. Someone tried to rob a high-security vault. Violet and Harry stared. Really? She said. What happened to them? Nothing. That's why it's such big news. They haven't been caught. My dad says it must have been a powerful dark wizard to get round Gringotts, but they don't think they took anything. That's what's odd. Course, everyone gets scared when something like this happens, in case you know who's behind it. Violet turned this news over in her mind. She was starting to get a prickle of fear every time you know who was mentioned. She supposed this was all part of entering the magical world, but it had been a lot more comfortable listening to Harry say Voldemort without worrying. What's your Quidditch team? Ron asked. We don't know any, Harry confessed. What? Ron looked dumbfounded. Oh, you wait. It's the best game in the world. And he was off, explaining all about the 4 balls and the positions of the 7 players, describing famous games he'd been to with his brothers and the broomstick he'd like to get if he had the money. He was just talking them through the finer points of the game when the compartment door slid open again. But it wasn't Neville, the toadless boy, or even Hermione Granger this time. 3 boys entered, and Violet recognized the middle one at once. It was the pale boy from Madame Malkin's robe shop. He was looking between the twins with a lot more interest than he'd shown in Diagon Alley. Is it true? He said. They're saying all down the train that the Potters are in this compartment, so it's you too, is it? Yes, said Harry. He was looking at the other boys. Both of them were thick-set and looked extremely mean. Standing on either side of the pale boy, they looked like bodyguards. Oh, this is Crabbe and this is Goyle, said the pale boy carelessly, evidently noticing where Harry was looking. And my name's Malfoy, Draco Malfoy. Ron gave a slight cough, which might have been hiding a snigger. Draco Malfoy looked at him. Think my name's funny, you do. No need to ask who you are. My father told me all the Weasleys have red hair, freckles, and more children than they can afford. He turned back to the twins. You'll soon find out some wizarding families are much better than others. You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort. I can help you there. He held out his hand to shake Harry's, but Harry didn't take it. I think I can tell who the wrong sort are for myself. Thank you, he said coolly. You're even worse at making friends than I thought, Violet sneered. And didn't I tell you to leave us alone? Draco Malfoy didn't go red, but a pink tinge appeared in his pale cheeks. I'd be careful if I were you too, he said slowly. Unless you're a bit politer, you'll go the same way as your parents. They didn't know what was good for them either. You hang around with riffraff like the Weasleys and that Hagrid, and it'll rub off on you. Both Harry and Ron stood up. Violet grabbed her brother's sleeve, but didn't take her eyes off of Draco Malfoy. Get out, she said, more bravely than she felt. There was a funny rattling sound coming from the wall of the compartment. Now! Violet felt a sudden force in the middle of her chest like a thunderclap, and Draco Malfoy staggered backward as an invisible gust of wind seemed to batter against him and the other, larger boys. He stared at her with wide, hate-filled eyes. How dare you? I said get out. Another clap of force seemed to follow her voice, and then all 3 of the boys were pushed backward out into the corridor. The compartment door slammed shut in their faces. Violet glared through the glass until they hurried away, back down to wherever they had come from. Perhaps it was Violet's gaze that drove them off, or perhaps that heard footsteps, because a moment later, Hermione Granger came in. "What has been going on?" she said, looking at the two boys on their feet and everyone's wind-tousled hair. "Blimey," said Ron, and Violet realized he was staring at her. "How did you out of that?" Violet blinked at him. "I don't know. I just wanted him to leave." "Were you doing magic?" Hermione asked, sounding very disapproving. "You'll get in trouble before we even get there." Violet shook her head helplessly. "No, I didn't mean to. I just though if I could get them out the door." "She didn't use a wand," Ron said, still staring. "I used to do little bits of magic when I was a kid, but never anything like that. Have you ever done it before?" Violet was blushing now, with all the attention on her. She remembered the glass enclosure at the museum, and a time where Dudley had tried to grab her only to let go yelping in pain, but she didn't feel like mentioning any of that with everyone looking at her so intently. "I'm just glad they're gone," Harry said loudly, coming to her rescue. He sat back down and grabbed her hand. "You've met Malfoy before?" Ron asked. Harry explained about their meeting in Diagon Alley. "I've heard of his family," Ron said darkly. "They were some of the first to come back to our side after you-know-who disappeared, said they'd been bewitched. My dad doesn't believe it. He says Malfoy's father didn't need an excuse to go over to the dark side." He turned to Hermione. "Sorry, but who are you?" "Hermione Granger," Violet said before Hermione herself could answer. "I met her in the corridor earlier. She was helping look for the toad." "So then you're Harry Potter," Hermione said, her attention now on Harry. She stuck out her hand, and he shook it dumbly. "I've read all about you, too." "And you are," she swiveled in place and put her hand out toward a very startled Ron. Ron Weasley. Pleasure. You've got dirt on your nose, by the way, did you know?" She turned to the compartment at large. "You'd all better hurry up and put your robes on. I've just been up to the front to ask the conductor, and he says we're nearly there. I'm ever so excited." "Would you mind leaving while we change?" Ron said, scowling at her as he rubbed furiously at the side of his nose. "All right," said Hermione in a sniffy voice. "I only came in here because people outside are behaving very childishly, racing up and down the corridors." Ron glared at her as she left. Violet peered out of the window. It was getting dark. She could see mountains and forests under a deep purple sky. The train did seem to be slowing down. The boys took off their jackets, and Violet unbuttoned her sweater, and they all pulled on their long black robes. Ron's were a bit short for him. You could see his sneakers underneath them. A voice echoed through the train. "We will be reaching Hogwarts in 5 minutes' time. Please leave your luggage on the train. It will be taken to the school separately." Violet's stomach lurched with nerves, and Ron, she saw, looked pale under his freckles. She and Harry shared a look between them, each seeking reassurance from the other. They all crammed their pockets with the last of the sweets and joined the crowd throning in the corridor. The train slowed right down and finally stopped. People pushed their way toward the door and out onto a tiny, dark platform. Violet shivered in the cold night air. She wished she'd left her sweater on. Then a lamp came bobbing over the heads of the students, and Violet heard a familiar voice. Furs years over here." "All right there, you two." Hagrid's big hair face beamed over the sea of heads. "Come on, follow me any more Furs years. Mind your step now. Furs years follow me." Slipping and stumbling, they followed Hagrid down what seemed to be a steep, narrow path. It was so dark on either side of them that Violet, though there must be thick trees there. She and Harry held tight to one another's hands. Nobody spoke much. Neville, the boy who kept losing his toad, sniffed once or twice. "You'll get your furs sight our Hogwarts in a sec," Hagrid called over his shoulder. "Juice round this bend here." There was a loud ooh. The narrow path had opened suddenly onto the edge of a great black lake. Perched atop a high mountain on the other side, its windows sparkling in the starry sky, with a vast castle with many turrets and towers. "No more'n 4 to a boat," Hagrid called, pointing to a fleet of little boats sitting in the water by the shore. Violet, Ron and Harry were followed into their boat by Hermione, while a mournful Neville was left looking about for an empty seat. "Everyone in," shouted Hagrid, who had a boat to himself. Right then forward, and the fleet of little boats moved off all at once, gliding across the lake, which was smooth as glass. Everyone was silent, staring up at the great castle overhead. It towered over them as they sailed nearer and nearer to the cliff on which it stood. "Heads down!" yelled Hagrid as the first boats reached the cliff. They all bent their heads, and the little boats carried them through a curtain of ivy that hid a wide opening in the cliff face. They were carried along a dark tunnel, which seemed to be taking them right underneath the castle, until they reached a kind of underground harbor where they clambered out onto rocks and pebbles. "Oi, you there! Is this your toad?" said Hagrid, who was checking the boats as people climbed out of them. "Trevor!" cried Neville blissfully, holding out his hands. Then they clambered up a passageway in the rock after Hagrid's lamp, coming out at last onto smooth, damp grass right in the shadow of the castle. They walked up a flight of stone steps and crowded around the huge oak front door. "Everyone here, you there, still got your toad?" Hagrid raised a gigantic fist and knocked 3 times on the castle door. Chapter 6: The Sorting Hat. The door swung open at once. A tall, black-haired witch in emerald-green robes stood there. She had a very stern face, and Violet's first thought was that this was not someone to cross. "The Fur's years, Professor McGonagall," said Hagrid. "Thank you, Hagrid. I will take them from here." She pulled the door wide. The entrance hall was so big you could have fit the whole of the Dursleys' house in it. The stone walls were lit with flaming torches like the ones at Gringotts. The ceiling was too high to make out, and a magnificent marble staircase, facing them, led to the upper floors. They followed Professor McGonagall across the flagged stone floor. Violet could hear the drone of hundreds of voices from a doorway to the right. The rest of the school must already be here. But Professor McGonagall showed the first years into a small, empty chamber off the hall. They crowded in, standing rather closer together than they would usually have done, peering about nervously. "Welcome to Hogwarts," said Professor McGonagall. "The start-of-term banquet will begin shortly, but before you take your seats in the Great Hall, you will be sorted into your houses. The sorting is a very important ceremony because, while you are here, your house will be something like your family within Hogwarts. You will have classes with the rest of your house, sleep in your house dormitory, and spend free time in your house common room. The 4 houses are called Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Each house has its own noble history, and each has produced outstanding witches and wizards. While you are at Hogwarts, your triumphs will earn your house points, while any rule breaking will lose house points. At the end of the year, the house with the most points is awarded the House Cup, a great honor. I hope each of you will be a credit to whichever house becomes yours. The sorting ceremony will take place in a few minutes in front of the rest of the school. I suggest you all smarten yourselves up as much as you can while you are waiting." Her eyes lingered for a moment on Neville's cloak, which was fastened under his left ear, and on Ron's smudged nose. Harry was trying to flatten his hair. "I shall return when we are ready for you," said Professor McGonagall. "Please wait quietly." She left the chamber. Violet swallowed. "How exactly do they sort us into houses?" she whispered to Ron. "Some sort of test, I think. Fred said it hurts a lot, but I think he was joking." Violet's heart gave a terrible jolt. A test, in front of the whole school. But she didn't know any magic, yet what on earth would she have to do? She hadn't expected something like this the moment they arrived. She looked around anxiously and saw everyone else looked terrified too. No one was talking much, except Hermione Granger, who was whispering very fast about all the spells she'd learned and wondering which one she'd need. Violet tried hard not to listen to her. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Any second now, Professor McGonagall would come back and lead her to her doom. Then something happened that made her jump about a foot in the air. Several people behind her screamed. "What the?" she gasped. So did the people around her. About 20 ghosts had just streamed through the back wall. Pearly white and slightly transparent, they glided across the room, talking to one another and hardly glancing at the first years. They seemed to be arguing. What looked like a fat little monk was saying, Forgive and forget, I say. We ought to give him a second chance. My dear Friar, haven't we given Peeves all the chances he deserves? He gives us all a bad name, and he's really not even a ghost, I say. What are you all doing here? A ghost wearing a ruff and tights had suddenly noticed the first years. Nobody answered. New students, sat the fat friar, smiling around at them. About to be sorted, I suppose. A few people nodded mutely. Hope to see you in Hufflepuff, said the friar. My old house. Move along now, said a sharp voice. The sorting ceremony's about to start. Professor McGonagall had returned. One by one, the ghosts floated away through the opposite wall. Now form a line, Professor McGonagall told the first years, and follow me. Feeling oddly as though her legs had turned to lead, Violet got into line behind Harry, with Ron behind her, and they walked out of the chamber, back across the hall, and through a pair of double doors into the great hall. Violet had never even imagined such a strange and splendid place. It was lit by thousands and thousands of candles that were floating in midair over 4 long tables, where the rest of the students were sitting. These tables were laid with glittering golden plates and goblets. At the top of the hall was another long table where the teachers were sitting. Professor McGonagall led the first years up here, so that they came to a halt in a line facing the other students, with the teachers behind them. The hundreds of faces staring at them looked like spotlights fixed on them from each and every angle. Darted here and there among the students, the ghosts shone misty silver. Mainly to avoid all the staring eyes, Violet looked upward and saw a velvety black ceiling dotted with stars. She heard Hermione whisper, "It's bewitched to look like the sky outside. I read about it in Hogwarts, a history." It was hard to believe there was a ceiling there at all, and that the great hall didn't simply open on to the heavens. Violet quickly looked down again as Professor McGonagall silently placed a 4-legged stool in front of the first years. On top of the stool, she put a pointed wizard's hat. This hat was patched and frayed and extremely dirty. Aunt Petunia wouldn't have let it in the house. Maybe we have to try and get a rabbit out of it, Violet thought wildly. That seemed the sort of thing, noticing that everyone in the hall was now staring at the hat. She stared at it, too. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. Then the hat twitched. A rip near the brim opened wide like a mouth, and the hat began to sing. "Oh, you may not think I'm pretty, but don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. You can keep your bowlers black, your top hat sleek and tall, for I'm the Hogwarts sorting hat, and I can cap them all. There's nothing hidden in your head the sorting hat can't see, so try me on, and I will tell you where you ought to be. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at hearts. Their daring, nerve, and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Or perhaps in Slytherin you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folk use any means to achieve their ends. So put me on, don't be afraid, and don't get in a flap. You're in safe hands, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap." The whole hall burst into applause as the hat finished its song. It bowed to each of the 4 tables and then became quite still again. "So we've just got to try on the hat," Ron whispered from behind her. "I'll kill Fred. He was going on about wrestling a troll." Violet smiled weakly. Yes, trying on the hat was a lot better than having to do a spell, but she did wish they could have tried it on without everyone watching. The hat seemed to be asking rather a lot. Violet didn't feel brave or quick-witted or any of it at the moment. If only the hat had mentioned a house for people who wanted to crawl into a hole and be forgotten, that would have been the one for her. Professor McGonagall now stepped forward holding a long parchment. "When I call your name, you will sit on the stool and put on the hat to be sorted," she said. Abbot Hannah, a pink-faced girl with blonde pigtails, stumbled out of line, sat down, and put on the hat which fell right down over her eyes. A moment's pause. "Hufflepuff," shouted the hat. The table on the right cheered and clapped as Hannah went to sit down at the Hufflepuff table. Violet saw the ghost of the fat friar waving merrily to her. "Bones, Susan." "Hufflepuff," shouted the hat again, and Susan scuttled off to sit next to Hannah. "Boot, Terry." "Ravenclaw." The second table from the left clapped this time. Several Ravenclaws stood up to shake hands with Terry as he joined them. Brocklehurst, Mandy, went to Ravenclaw too, but Brown, Lavender, became the first new Gryffindor, and the table on the far left exploded with cheers. Violet could see Ron's twin brothers catcalling. Bulstrode, Millicent, then became a Slytherin. The cheering at this table was more subdued, but Millicent was greeted by a sea of smiles. Violet was starting to feel definitely sick now. She remembered being for teams during gym at their old school. She and Harry had always been the last ones to be chosen, not because they were no good, because no one wanted Dudley to think they liked him. Finch Fletchley, Justin. Hufflepuff. Sometimes, Violet noticed, the hat shouted out the house at once, but at others it took a little while to decide. Finnegan, Seamus, the sandy-haired boy next to Harry in line, sat on the stool for almost a whole minute before the hat declared him a Gryffindor. Granger, Hermione. Hermione almost ran to the stool and jammed the hat eagerly on her head. "Gryffindor," shouted the hat. Ron groaned. A horrible thought struck Violet, as horrible thoughts always do when you're very nervous. What if she wasn't chosen at all? What if she just sat there with the hat over her eyes for ages, until Professor McGonagall jerked it off her head and said there had obviously been a mistake, and she'd better get back on the train? Or worse, what if she and Harry were separated? Would they be allowed to speak to each if they were put into different houses? Could they ask to be switched, so they didn't have to be apart? When Neville Longbottom, the boy who kept losing his toad, was called, he fell over on his way to the stool. The hat took a long time to decide with Neville. When it finally shouted Gryffindor, Neville ran off still wearing it, and had to jog back amid gales of laughter to give it to MacDougal Morag. Malfoy swaggered forward when his name was called, and the hat had barely touched his blonde hair when it screamed, "Slytherin." Malfoy went to join his friends Crabbe and Goyle, looking pleased with himself. There weren't many people left now. Moon, Nott, Parkinson, then a pair of twin girls, Patil and Patil, then Perks Sallien, and then Potter Harry. Harry tried to take a step forward but couldn't, and Violet realized she was holding onto the back of his robes. She let go at once and watched as her brother stepped forward. Whispers had suddenly broken out like hissing fires all over the hall. "Potter," did she say? "The Harry Potter." The other remaining first years were looking at her now, too. She could feel the eyes on her from all directions, full of wonder and curiosity and suspicion. Harry's face was half covered by the enormous old hat, so Violet couldn't look to him for comfort. Ron, beside her now, nudged her gently with his elbow in what might have been an accident or perhaps a kind gesture. It grounded her slightly, and she kept her eyes fixed on Harry, waiting. "Gryffindor," the hat shouted. The loudest cheer yet erupted from the Gryffindor table as Harry walked shakily toward it, trying to find Violet's gaze in the crowd before sitting down. He waved, even as an older boy grabbed his other hand and shook it vigorously, and smiled back encouragingly at her. "Potter, Violet," called Professor McGonagall. Violet snapped to attention. "It's the other one," she heard whispered as she took the few short steps up to the stool. The last thing Violet saw before the hat dropped over her eyes was the hall full of people craning to get a good look at her. Next second she was looking at the black inside of the hat. She waited. "Oh, dear," said the small voice in her ear. "Aren't we a loyal one? You seek comfort and familiarity, but there's a thirst for knowledge there as well, and something else. Such strength in one so young. A pity your mind is made up, when there is a much more rewarding path waiting for you." Violet frowned, her heart hammering in her chest. What was that supposed to mean? How could any path be rewarding if she had to walk it without Harry? "He'll never be far from you," said the small voice, making her jump. "Your hearts are closer than most, and I sense not even the greatest of forces could pull you apart without effort. But you are destined to struggle, child. There is greatness bubbling within you, and I can see only one place able to bring forth the potential to help you grow. Remember this. Separate paths need not lead to different places. You'll find your way in Slytherin." Violet heard the hat shout the last word to the whole hall. She took off the hat and stood in shock, trying to remember which table belonged to Slytherin. It was then that she realized no one was clapping. No one was cheering. A sea of open faces stared up at her, looking just as shaken up as she felt. And then, like a dull roar, the second table from the right began to clap and call out to her. Violet wandered dumbly toward the now wildly cheering table. She looked across the hall toward Harry and found him staring at her. Mouth hanging open, she waved weakly. Finding herself a seat was not difficult. Space was made immediately as she approached, and it seemed like everybody around wanted to shake her hand or pat her on the back. A swirl of names were whispered at her as people introduced themselves, and Violet retained none of it. Draco Malfoy sat on the opposite side of the table from her, a little ways down, and was openly staring at her with disbelief all over his pale face. Violet did not smile at him and looked away to shake the hand of an older girl to her left. She could see the high table properly now. At the end farthest from her sat Hagrid, who caught her eye and gave her a tentative thumbs up. Violet smiled back, and there, in the center of the high table, in a large gold chair, sat Albus Dumbledore. Violet recognized him at once from the card they'd gotten out of the chocolate frog on the train. Dumbledore's silver hair was the only thing in the whole hall that shone as brightly as the ghosts. Violet spotted Professor Quirrell, too, the nervous young man from the leaky cauldron. He was looking very peculiar now in a large purple turban, and now there were only 4 people left to be sorted. Thomas Dean, a black boy even taller than Ron, joined Harry at the Gryffindor table. Turpin, Lisa, became a Ravenclaw, and then it was Ron's turn. He was pale green by now. Violet crossed her fingers for him under the table, and a second later the hat had shouted, "Gryffindor." Next, Zabini Blaze was made a Slytherin and came to sit a few places away from Violet. Professor McGonagall rolled up her scroll and took the sorting hat away. Violet looked down at her empty gold plate. She had only just realized how hungry she was. The pumpkin pasties and cauldron cakes seemed ages ago. Albus Dumbledore had gotten to his feet. He was beaming at the students, his arms opened wide, as if nothing could have pleased him more than to see them all there. "Welcome," he said. "Welcome to a new year at Hogwarts. Before we begin our banquet, I would like to say a few words. And here they are, Nitwit, Blubber, Ardment, Tweak." "Thank you." He sat back down. Everybody clapped and cheered. Violet didn't know whether to laugh or not. She looked around for a friendly-looking face to ask, and her mouth fell open. The dishes in front of her were now piled with food. She had never seen so many things she liked to eat on one table. Roast beef, roast chicken, lamb chops, sausages, bacon and steak, boiled potatoes, roast potatoes, fries, Yorkshire pudding, radishes, turnips, gravy, mustard, and for some strange reason, peppermint humbugs. The Dursleys had never outright starved Harry and Violet, but they had never been allowed to eat as much as they liked. Dudley had always taken anything they really wanted, even if it made him sick. Violet piled her plate with a bit of everything except the peppermints and began to eat. It was all delicious. She had just stuffed a large bite of roast beef into her mouth when she felt a tapping on her shoulder. "You're the Potter girl, aren't you?" The speaker was a rather chubby black girl that had been sorted near the beginning of the ceremony. She was leaning behind the boy next to Violet, smiling at her. Violet nodded meekly. "I heard some of the others talking about you on the train. You were raised by muggles, weren't you?" "Yes," said Violet, immediately tense. She caught a few curious glances thrown in her direction, but no one else would meet her eye. The other girl seemed to notice her discomfort. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said quickly. "I'm a half-blood myself. Actually, my mother was a witch, but she died when I was young, and my dad brought me up himself. Only he's a muggle, I suppose. Sorry, I forgot I'm supposed to introduce myself. I'm Tracy Davis." She put out her hand expectantly, and Violet shook it on reflex. She didn't know what being half-blood meant, but was pleased to hear that she wasn't the only one at the table who grew up in the Muggle world. "I'm Violet," she said. "Pleased to meet you." "Pleased to meet you too," said Tracy brightly. When her smile widened, the metal braces on her teeth became visible. "I was so nervous on the train, not knowing what to expect. My dad told me as much as he knew about magic and all, but it never really made sense until I got my letter." "Were you excited?" "Nervous, more like," Violet said, letting herself relax a little bit. "We didn't know anything about magic or Hogwarts or wizards until Hagrid gave us our letters. It was all very sudden." "Is that the great big man up at the table?" asked Tracy, and Violet nodded. "So he's not scary then, is he? He does look a bit frightening." "He's not scary all, he's very kind. He helped us buy all our school supplies." Headed. "What about your pa?" Tracy quickly clapped a hand over her mouth, looking mortified. "Oh, right, sorry. I didn't mean I'm still learning all the history, but I heard about. It's all right," said Violet. "I'm sorry about your mother. What does your father do?" "Oh, he's a sales manager," said Tracy, brightening up immediately. "He works at a marketing firm in Bristol. He's wonderful, really, and he was so happy for me to go to Hogwarts like my mum did. When I get back, I've promised to tell Heimverithingi I've learned about magic." "Not that it's any of his business," said a voice from down the table. Violet looked up and saw that Malfoy was watching them and had been listening to every word she and Tracy had said. He was sneering. The expression didn't do any favors for his pointed, rodent-like face, in Violet's opinion. "I can't believe that sort of thing is even allowed." "Sorry," said Tracy, looking round at Malfoy. "I don't believe we've met." "I should hope not," Malfoy said nastily, and the two big boys seated on either side of him, the same boys who were with him on the train, chuckled stupidly. "You don't think I should tell my dad what I learn at school?" Tracy asked. Malfoy's sneer disappeared, replaced with a much uglier expression. "I don't think Ro should be allowed to learn at this school," he said. "It's bad enough your mother went and married a muggle. She didn't need to put any more filth back into our world. Remember what I told you, Potter, about making friends with the wrong sort?" Violet glared daggers at Malfoy. "The only wrong sort I'm seeing here is you, Malfoy." "I'm worth more than you'll ever be, Potter," Malfoy snarled, his cheeks slightly pink. "Unlike you and your brother, I come from a family who knows the value of their bloodline. My father's father's father was advisor to the Minister of Magic, while yours was probably wearing rags out in the middle of a forest. My mother's line can trace itself back to dozens of the greatest wizarding families in Europe. Your mother was nothing but a filthy muggle. And you think that makes you better than her?" rang a new voice from Violet's left. She turned and found the girl beside her, the same older girl that had shaken her hand when she sat down, staring intently at Malfoy. Violet realized, suddenly, how quiet their section of the table had become. Chatter and conversation buzzed all around them, but it was as though they were all within a bubble of silence. "I asked you a question, boy," said the older girl. Draco was flushed, even more pink, but there was still anger in his narrowed eyes. "Of course it makes me better than her." "Not that being better than her, Ishard. That's an ugly little attitude you've got there," said the girl, looking at Malfoy down her rather long nose and quite the mouth for a first year. "And who are you then, telling me how I should talk?" "I'm Gemma Farley," the girl said. "I'm one of your house prefects, and I suggest you learn to mind your manners toward your fellow housemates. Otherwise, Professor Snape will want to have a word with whoever's responsible for losing Slytherin points before the feast has even ended." Malfoy paled slightly. "You can't threaten me." "I'll tell my father." "Said your name's Malfoy, isn't it? I've heard a few things about your father," said Gemma coolly. "I wouldn't be in such a rush to tell him you've been making an arse of yourself on your very first day at school if I were you." Draco's mouth fell open. A few of the older students chuckled along the table. Gemma kept her eyes on Malfoy as she took a large bit of roast chicken and snorted when he was the first to angrily look away. "Potter Davis," she said through a mouthful of chicken, and both Violet and Tracy snapped their gazes toward her. She gave them both a thumbs up and swallowed. "Welcome to Slytherin. We're very glad to have you here. If that little shite gives you any more trouble, you come to me, yeah." Tracy and Violet giggled and nodded. Malfoy was no longer looking at them, only muttering to Crabbe and Goyle, both of whom would grunt stupidly every few seconds. Violet was feeling much better about being placed into Slytherin, even if it did mean being away from Harry. Perhaps, for the first time in her life, she would be able to make herself some friends. "Who was that you mentioned earlier?" she asked Gemma, who gave her a blank look. "The professor who wouldn't be happy about losing points." "Oh, right, Professor Snape," Gemma said, gesturing toward the high table. "In the middle there, near Dumbledore, he's head of Slytherin House. He teaches potions as well, so read up if you want to get in his good graces tomorrow, and trust me, Yawanto be in his good graces." Violet looked up to where Gemma had pointed and saw a man with greasy black hair, a hooked nose, and sallow skin. He was talking to Professor Quirrell, who was practically shrinking away from him. "Is he very cross?" Tracy asked timidly. "He does look awfully cross." "He's not so bad," said a new voice. The boy who was sitting between Tracy and Violet lifted his head with a small smirk. "At least, not to us. Best keep your head down, though, at least for a while. If you're an idiot, he'll tear you pieces, and if he thinks you're smart enough to be worth teaching, he'll push you so hard you'll thought you were stupid." "Don't scare them off, Warrington," Gemma said, this time reaching for a gravy boat. She leaned in toward Violet conspiratorially. "Snape can smell fear, you know. At least, I wouldn't put it past him with a nose like that one." Violet snuck another glance at Professor Snape. She didn't really believe that he could smell fear, but just on the side of caution, she would do her best to be brave around him. At last, the desserts too disappeared, and Professor Dumbledore got to his feet again. The hall fell silent. Just a few more words now that we are all fed and watered. I have a few start-of-term notices to give you. First years should note that the forest on the grounds is forbidden to all pupils, and a few older students would do well to remember that as well." Dumbledore's twinkling eyes flashed in the direction of the Gryffindor table. "I have also been asked by Mr. Filch, the caretaker, to remind you all that no magic should be used between classes in the corridors. Quidditch trials will be held in the second week of the term. Anyone interested in playing for their house teams should contact Madam Hooch. And finally, I must tell you that this year, the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds to everyone who does not wish to die a very painful death." A few brief laughs rang out across the hall, but were quickly silenced. Dumbledore did not appear to be joking. "And now, before we go to bed, let us sing the school song," cried Dumbledore. Violet noticed that other teachers' smiles had become rather fixed. Dumbledore gave his wand a little flick, as if he was trying to get a fly off the end, and a long gold ribbon flew out of it, which rose high above the tables and twisted itself, snake-like, into words. "Everyone pick their favorite tune," said Dumbledore, "and off we go." And the school bellowed, "Hogwarts, Hogwarts, Hoggy-Warty Hogwarts, teach us something, please. Whether we be old and bald or young with scabby knees, our heads could do with filling with some interesting stuff. For now they're bare and full of air, dead flies, and bits of fluff. So teach us things worth knowing. Bring back what we forgot. Just do your best. We'll do the rest, and learn till our brains all rot." At last, only the Weasley twins were left, singing along to a very slow funeral march. Dumbledore conducted their last few lines with his wand, and when they had finished, he was one of those who clapped the loudest. "Ah, music," he said, wiping his eyes. "A magic beyond all we do here. And now, bedtime. Off you trot." The Slytherin first years followed Gemma through the chattering crowds and back out into the great hall. Violet fought to find Harry among the sea of heads, but the pair of them only managed a brief smile and wave before they were swept off in separate directions. Harry followed the rest of the Gryffindors up the grand marble staircase, while Violet followed her classmates through a corridor off the left side of the great hall and began the descent down a long, long set of stairs. The walls of the corridor were lit with flickering torches, and the sound of dozens of little footsteps bounced loudly off the dark stone walls. They passed several doors on either side of them, but were led silently deeper in what looked to be some sort of dungeon. Finally, just as Violet was starting to feel nervous again, Gemma stopped them all in the middle of an empty stretch of hallway. "Melira," said Gemma, to what appeared to be a blank stretch of all. Only suddenly it wasn't a wall at all. A great stone door had swung inward, revealing a large room beyond. They all scrambled inside and found themselves in the slithering common room. It was a long, low room lit with greenish lamps and furnished with dark chairs and sofas. A large section of the back wall appeared to be made entirely of glass, and Violet could see dark shapes swaying on the other side. Gemma directed the boys through one door to their dormitory and the girls through another. Down another stone staircase, they found their beds at last. 5 four-posters hung with deep green silk curtains. Their trunks had already been brought up. Too tired to talk much, they pulled on their pajamas and fell into bed. "I'm so excited for classes tomorrow. I don't know if I can sleep," said Tracy through the hangings, sounding like she was nearly asleep already. Violet was going to ask Tracy which class she was most excited about, but she fell asleep almost at once. It was the first time in her life that she had slept in her very own bed without another body beside her. It was a restless, uneven sleep. She kept waking up in a panic because Harry wasn't next to her, but eventually Violet drifted into a deep slumber and did not wake again until the next morning. Chapter 7. The Potions Master. "There, look, where? Next to the girl with all the hair. The short one. Did you see her face? Have you seen her twin?" Whispers followed Violet from the moment she left her dormitory the next day. People lining up outside classrooms stood on tiptoe to get a look at her, or doubled back to pass her in the corridor again, staring. Violet desperately wished they wouldn't. Aside from making her want to cry, they were also making it hard for her to find the way to her classes. There were 142 staircases in Hogwarts, wide, sweeping ones, narrow, rickety ones, some that led somewhere different on a Friday, some with a vanishing step halfway up that you had to remember to jump. Then there were doors that wouldn't open unless you asked politely or tickled them in exactly the right spot, and doors that weren't really doors at all, but solid walls just pretending. It was also very hard to remember where anything was, because it all seemed to move around a lot. The people in the portraits kept going to visit each other, and Violet was sure the coats of armor could talk. The ghosts didn't help, either. It was always a nasty shock when one of them glided suddenly through a door you were trying to open. The slithering ghost was called the Bloody Baron, and everyone warned that he should be left alone, unless one was absolutely desperate. Desperation could come in the form of being lost for hours, or it could come in the form of Peeves. Peeves was a poltergeist in the form of a little man with wicked, dark eyes and a wide mouth, and woe betide anyone who came across him in their hour of need. Peeves was worth 2 locked doors and a trick staircase if you met him when you were late for class. He would drop waste paper baskets on your head, pull rugs from under your feet, grab your nose, and screech, "Got your conch." Even worse than Peeves, if that was possible, was the caretaker, Argus Filch. He was a stooped, elderly man who appeared to be perpetually furious, and whose only joy in the world was catching students doing something wrong and threatening to lock them in the dungeons until they rot. Filch owned a cat called Mrs. Norris, a scrawny, dust-colored creature with bulging, lamp-like eyes just like Filch's. She patrolled the corridors alone. Break a rule in front of her, put just one toe out of line, and she'd wish off for Filch, who'd appear wheezing 2 seconds later. Filch knew the secret passageways of the school better than anyone, except perhaps the Weasley twins, and could pop up as suddenly as any of the ghosts. The students all hated him, and it was the dearest ambition of many to give Mrs. Norris a good kick. And then, once you have managed to find them, there were the classes themselves. There was a lot more to magic, as Violet quickly found out, than waving your wand and saying a few funny words. They had to study the night skies through their telescopes every Wednesday night at midnight and learn the names of different stars and the movements of the planets. 3 times a week they went out to the greenhouses behind the castle to study herbology, with a dumpy little witch called Professor Sprout, where they learned how to take care of all the strange plants and fungi and found out what they were used for. One of the easiest classes for Violet was History of Magic, which was the only one taught by a ghost. Professor Binns had been very old indeed when he had fallen asleep in front of the staff room fire and got up next morning to teach, leaving his body behind him. Binns droned on, while all the students had to do was scribble down names and dates, and try not to confuse Emeric the Evil with Uric the Oddball. Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, was a tiny little wizard who had to stand on a pile of books to see over his desk. At the start of their first class, he took the roll call, and when he reached Violet's name, he gave an excited squeak and toppled out of sight. Professor McGonagall was again different. Violet had been quite right to think she wasn't a teacher to cross. Strict and clever, she gave them a talking to the moment they sat down in her first class. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts, she said. Anyone messing around in my class will leave and will not come back. You have been warned. Then she changed her desk into a pig and back again. They were all very impressed and couldn't wait to get started, but soon realized they weren't going to be changing furniture into animals for a long time. After taking a lot of complicated notes, they were each given a match and started trying to turn it into a needle. By the end of the lesson, and much to her own surprise, only Violet had made any difference to her match. Professor McGonagall showed the class how it had gone all silver and pointy and gave Violet a rare smile. The class everyone had really been looking forward to was Defense Against the Dark Arts, but Quirrell's lessons turned out to be a bit of a joke. His classroom smelled strongly of garlic, which everyone said was to ward off a vampire he'd met in Romania and was afraid would be coming back to get him one of these days. His turban, he told them, had been given to him by an African prince as a thank you for getting rid of a troublesome zombie. They weren't quite sure they believed this story. For one thing, when a boy called Theodore Nut asked eagerly to hear how Quirrell had fought off the zombie, Quirrell went pink and started talking about the weather. For another, they had noticed that a funny smell hung around the turban, and the Weasley twins insisted that it was stuffed full of garlic as well, so that Quirrell was protected wherever he went. Violet was very relieved so find out she wasn't miles behind everyone else. Lots of people had come from Muggle families, and like her, hadn't any idea that they were witches and wizards. There was so much to learn that even people like Malfoy didn't have much of a head start. Malfoy was another problem. He and his cronies, Crabbe and Goyle, liked to set up in the common room for hours at a time, hogging the best chairs and the closest seats to the fireplace. They talked too loud for anyone to focus around them and jeered at anyone brave enough to ask them to be quiet. Even warnings from prefects and other older students did little to tell them off. After a while they would be back at it again. As such, Violet had spent very little time in the common room so far. Things were quieter in the dormitory. The absolute hardest thing about school so far was being apart from Harry Violet, and her twin had never spent more than a few hours apart for the entire duration of their lives before coming to Hogwarts now. They were lucky to have even a few minutes of time to spend with one another. They were lucky enough to share a few classes with each other's houses. That morning, they were set for double potions with the Gryffindors, which Violet had been assured would be a treat. Everyone keeps saying that Snape favors us, since he's our head of house, Tracy was saying as she spread marmalade on her toast, and that he's got some sort of grudge against Gryffindors. We'll be able to see if it's true. That doesn't sound fair, said Violet, frowning. Harry was a Gryffindor, after all. Would Professor Snape treat them differently because of that? Juice, then, the mail arrived. Violet had gotten used to this by now, but it had given her a bit of a shock on the first morning, when about 100 owls had suddenly streamed into the great hall during breakfast, circling the tables until they saw their owners, and dropping letters and packages into their laps. Sometimes she would see Hedwig fly in with all the others and start by to nibble toast from Harry's hand, but so far she hadn't brought him anything. Violet didn't even notice her this morning. She was so busy fretting about their first potions lesson. Roman 6, guess what? Violet whirled around in her seat at the sound of Harry's voice behind her, walking between the tables with a piece of paper in his hand. Morning, Harry. She quickly scooted over so that her brother could sit beside her, thrusting the paper into her face as he did so. Look what Hedwig brought me this morning, Harry said excitedly. Do you want to go? Violet quickly skimmed the letter. It was written in recognizable, very untidy scrawl. Dear Harry, Violet, I know you get Friday afternoons off, so would you like to come and have a cup of tea with me around 3? I want to hear all about your first week. Send us an answer back with Hedwig. Hagrid, that sounds lovely, she said excitedly. Please tell him I'll be there. We can all catch up, and I can tell you about Transfiguration class yesterday. Violet was about to send Harry to write his reply when, beside her, Tracy loudly cleared her throat. Oh, Harry, this is Tracy Davis. She's my friend. Violet quickly looked at Tracy to confirm that they were, in fact, friends, and that she hadn't been misinterpreting the last 5 days of politeness and interaction. But Tracy wasn't even looking at her. She had already stuck her hand out for Harry to shake, staring blatantly at his forehead all the while. Pleased to meet you, Harry Potter, said, her voice higher than usual. Harry's ears were looking a little pink. Nice to meet you, too, Tracy. I think I should go tell Hagrid we'll be coming before Hedwig flies off again. See you at 3. Potions lessons took place down in one of the dungeons, on the other side of the hall from the Slytherin common room. It was colder here than in the main castle, and the atmosphere was not brightened by the pickled animals floating in glass jars around the walls. As it was their only shared class together, Violet and Harry took their seats next to one another with apologies to their usual friend. Ron and Harry were already inseparable, and Tracy Davis had become a fast friend to Violet ever since their meeting at the feast. It was good, though, for brother and sister to be side by side again, even if what came next was not so good at all. Snape, like Flitwick, started the class by taking the roll call, and like Flitwick, he paused at the name Potter. Ah, yes, he said softly, the Potter twins. Our new celebrities. Draco Malfoy and his friends Crabbe and Goyle sniggered behind their hands. Snape finished calling the names and looked up at the class. His eyes were black like Hagrid's, but they had none of Hagrid's warmth. They were cold and empty and made you think of dark tunnels. You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making, he began. He spoke in barely more than a whisper, but they caught every word like Professor McGonagall. Snape had the gift of keeping a class silent without effort. As there is little foolish wand-waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of the softly simmering cauldron with its shimmering fumes, the delicate power of liquids that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stop a death if you are as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach. More silence followed this little speech. Harry and Violet exchanged looks with raised eyebrows. Violet very much wanted to show that she wasn't a dunderhead. Mr. Potter, said Snape suddenly, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormhood? Violet's mind immediately cast back to the books she'd read and the notes she'd taken over the summer. Asphodel and wormhood, asphodel and wormhood. That was something important, wasn't it? Harry's brow was furrowed in the way it often was when he had no idea of the answer to a question Hermione Granger's had shot into the air. I don't know, sir, said Harry. Snape's lips curled into a sneer. Tut, fame clearly isn't everything. He ignored Hermione's hand. Let's try again. Potter, where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? Hermione stretched her hand as high into the air as it would go without leaving her seat. Violet, too, lifted her hand this time, just barely off the desk. Snape's black eyes flickered toward her for a moment, but he seemed oddly focused on Harry. Harry, who could only shake his head. "I don't know, sir. Thought you wouldn't open a book before coming, Potter?" That wasn't fair at all, Violet thought angrily. Harry had read through all of the required books over the summer, just like she had. Did Snape expect them to remember every single thing in 1,000 magical herbs and fungi? Snape was still ignoring Hermione's quivering hand. "What is the difference, Potter, between monkshood and wolfsbane?" Violet raised her hand higher. Hermione, not to be outdone, stood up, her hand stretching toward the dungeon's ceiling. "I don't know," said Harry quietly. "I think the girls do, though. Why don't you try them?" A few people laughed. Snape, however, was not pleased. "Sit down," he snapped at Hermione. Then he finally turned his attention on Violet, and she felt as though a bucket of ice water had been dumped over her head. There was something very cold behind his eyes. It made her regret putting her hand up at all. "Miss Potter," Snape said sharply. "Same questions." Violet swallowed. She had to fight herself to keep looking him in the eye. "Asphodel and wormwood together make a sleeping potion, I think. And a bezoar isn't a plant at all. It comes from an animal, but I can't remember which. But the question about monkshood and wolfsbane was a trick, wasn't it?" "I thought they were the same thing, sir." The class had gone silent. Snape was still looking intently at Violet, but she had watched his expression shift as she spoke. One eyebrow had slightly raised, and even some of that terrible coldness had gone out of his eyes. "Very good, Miss Potter," Snape said quietly. "Fortunately, at least one of you appears to be worth teaching. A point to Slytherin." An excited murmur rippled through the room from the other Slytherin students, but they all quickly fell quiet again. "The sleeping potion you are thinking of is one of the most powerful in the world, and is also known as the Draught of Living Death," said Snape, raising his voice more than before. "A bezoar does indeed come from an animal. It is a stone taken from the stomach of a goat, and it will save you from most poisons. You are also correct regarding monkshood and wolfsbane. They are the same plant, which also goes by the name of aconite. Well, why aren't you all copying that down?" There was a sudden rummaging for quills and parchment. Over the noise, Snape said, "And a point will be taken from Gryffindor House for your cheek, Mr. Potter." For the rest of the lesson, Snape put them all into pairs and set them mixing up a simple potion to cure boils. He swept around in his long black cloak, watching them weigh dried nettles and crush snake fangs, criticizing almost everyone. It was the Gryffindors that took the brunt of his ire. However, Tracy's prediction that he would favor his own house looked to be true. In particular, Snape paid special care to Draco Malfoy, whom he seemed to like. He was just telling everyone to look at the perfect way Malfoy had stewed his horned slugs. Even though Violet's looked exactly the same as his, Violet was in the process of rolling her eyes when she happened to glance at the table beside hers and Harry's. Ron was paired up with Neville Longbottom, and Neville had just picked something up from the table while Ron wasn't looking. He squinted up at Snape's notes on the blackboard, looked back at the thing in his hands, and shrugged. He raised his hand to drop it into the cauldron. "Wait!" Violet reached across and grabbed the sleeve of his robe, yanking his arm away before he could open his fingers. "Are you trying to blow yourself up?" Neville, whose face had turned a deep red, was staring at her along with half of the class. Footsteps approached from across the room, and Violet released Neville's sleeve just as Professor Snape appeared behind her, frowning. "What is the meaning of this interruption, Miss Potter?" Violet swallowed hard. Snape practically towered over her, and from this angle she could see clear up his hooked nose. "Sorry, sir," she said quickly. Neville was about to add his porcupine quills too early. Snape looked into Ron and Neville's cauldron. "At this stage, adding the quills is the next step in brewing this potion. Clearly you haven't read the instructions on the board." "But I have, sir," said Violet boldly, feeling the heat creep up her cheeks. She pointed at the scrawls written in chalk at the front of the room. "You said, before adding porcupine quills, cauldron must be removed from fire and allowed to cool. The fire is still burning right now." And so it was. Neville looked down at their cauldron and then at his own hand, still clenching the porcupine quills in his fist. Then he looked back up at Snape, who was sneering at him, and paled. Sorry, he stammered, tucking his hand quickly behind his hand. I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Idiot boy, snarled Snape. You've no idea how lucky you are Miss Potter took it upon herself to meddle in your assignment. Another point from Gryffindor for your woeful negligence. Potter, next time, let him figure it out himself. The lesson should stick better after a trip to the hospital wing. A point to Slytherin House. Yes, sir, Violet mumbled. When Snape had gone back to making his rounds, Neville caught her eye and mouthed, "Thank you." As they climbed the stone steps of the dungeon an hour later, Violet's mind was racing and her spirits were high. She'd earned 6 whole points for Slytherin in her very first week, and hopefully managed to follow the advice she'd been given about getting on Snape's good side. That was brilliant of you, Tracy said brightly, grabbing onto Violet's arm in excitement. I can't believe you knew all that from the book and saved that boy from hurting himself. Next class your brother is out of luck because you're sitting next to him from now on. Oh, and can I come and meet Hagrid with you? At 5 to 3 they left the castle and made their way across the grounds. Hagrid lived in a small wooden house on the edge of the forbidden forest. A crossbow and a pair of galoshes were outside the front door. Ron and Harry were already waiting for them. When Violet knocked, they heard a frantic scrabbling from inside and several booming barks. Then Hagrid's voice rang out, saying, "Back, Fang, back." Hagrid's big, hairy face appeared in the crack as he pulled the door open. "Hang on," he said. "Back, Fang." He let them in, struggling to keep a hold on the collar of an enormous black boarhound. There was only one room inside. Hams and pheasants were hanging from the ceiling. A copper kettle was boiling on the open fire, and in the corner stood a massive bed with a patchwork quilt over it. "Make yourselves at home," said Hagrid, letting go of Fang, who bounded straight at Ron and started licking his ears. Like Hagrid, Fang was clearly not as fierce as he looked. "This is Tracy," Violet said, noticing the way Tracy was staring, wide-eyed at Hagrid's massive form. Hagrid extended a hand with a smile, and Tracy's round face lit up with wonder as she placed her comparatively tiny hand into his. "Pleasure to meet ye, Miss Tracy." His expression shifted slightly as he let go, ambling over to the crackling fireplace in 2 giant strides. "Got ter say now, Violet, it was a shark hearin' that hat put ye into Slytherin. Nasty folks there, some of 'em. It's good ter see ye mackin' yourself some friends. Speakin' of, has that one got a name?" "This is Ron," Harry told Hagrid, who was now pouring boiling water into a large teapot and putting rock cakes onto a plate. "Another Weasley, for example," said Hagrid, glancing at Ron's freckles. "I spent half me life chassin' your twin brothers away from the forest." The rock cakes were shapeless mups with raisins that almost broke their teeth, but they all pretended to be enjoying them as they went around the table, telling Hagrid about their first lessons. Fang rested his head on Harry's knee and drooled all over his robes. All 4 of them were delighted to hear Hagrid call Filch, "that old git." "And as for that cat, Mrs. Norris, I'd like ter introduce her to Fang sometime. D'ye know, every time I got up ter the school, she follows me everywhere. Can't get rid of her. Filch puts her up to it." Violet and Harry took turns telling about Snape's lesson. While Violet felt fairly satisfied with herself after earning 2 house points in one lesson, Harry had a distinctly different opinion on the class. He seemed to think that Professor Snape didn't like him very much. Hagrid told that Snape liked hardly any of the students. "He looked to be getting along with Malfoy just fine," Tracy muttered into her tea. "Has that little twerp been givin' you any more trouble?" Hagrid asked. Both twins shook their heads. "They bother everyone," said Violet, "but he hasn't tried to pick on me anymore. I still don't think he likes me much after I told him off on the train." "You did more to him than that," Ron exclaimed, grinning. "You nearly blew him out the window." "It wasn't that bad," Violet said, blushing. Ron told Hagrid about their encounter with Malfoy on the train, the things he said, and the way Violet had made him leave them alone. By the end of it, Hagrid's great bushy eyebrows had shot up into his forehead. Jumpin', Jackalopes, Violet ye have got to be careful, lossen your temper like that. Young witches and wizards darn have as much control over their magic yet, and if ye darn mind it, ye could hurt someone. I wasn't trying to hurt him, Violet protested, and I wasn't even angry, really. I just wanted him to leave. I kept telling him to, and he wouldn't, so I made him. It was hard to read Hagrid's face behind the beard and hair, but Violet could tell immediately by his eyes that she had made him worry. I won't do it again, Hagrid, she said quickly. I promise, Hagrid nodded, yet Violet couldn't help thinking that he didn't quite meet her eyes when he did so. How's your brother, Charlie? Hagrid asked Ron. I liked him a lot, great with animals. Violet wondered if Hagrid had changed the subject on purpose. While Ron told Hagrid all about Charlie's work with dragons, Violet picked up a piece of paper that was lying on the table under the tea cozy. It was a cutting from Thedley Prophet. Gringotts break-in latest investigations continue into the break-in at Gringotts on 31 July, widely believed to be the work of dark wizards or witches unknown. Gringotts goblins today insisted nothing had been taken. The vault that was searched had in fact been emptied the same day. But we're not telling you what was in there, so keep your noses out of it if you know what's good for you, said a Gringotts spokesgoblin this afternoon. Violet remembered Ron telling them on the train that someone had tried to rob Gringotts, but Ron hadn't mentioned the date. Violet nudged Harry and passed him the news clipping. His eyes widened as he finished reading. Hagrid, said Harry loudly, and Violet very nearly kicked him under the table. That Gringotts break-in happened on our birthday. It might have been happening while we were there. There was no doubt about it. Hagrid definitely didn't meet anyone's eyes this time. He grunted and offered Harry another rock cake. Violet glared daggers at her brother. She'd meant for him to read it, and then they could talk about it together. Later, not go blurting it out and making Hagrid uncomfortable again. The vault they had visited, 713, only held a tiny, grubby little package, which Hagrid took surely that counted as emptying the vault, since there was nothing else in it. And what exactly had Hagrid said about why they went to Vault 713 in the first place? Hadn't Dumbledore sent him? Did Dumbledore know that somebody was going to try and steal whatever that little package was? So far, Violet hadn't thought about any of her lessons as hard as she thought about tea with Hagrid and their trip to Gringotts. She kept thinking about it, well into the night, and eventually drifted into a fretful, nervous sleep. Chapter 8. The Flying Lesson. Violet had never believed she would meet a boy she hated more than Dudley, but that was before she met Draco Malfoy. He was an arrogant, pompous, spoiled brat who wasn't happy unless everyone around him was miserable or afraid of him. He bullied not only the other first years, but any second or third years that wouldn't stand up to him, and he constantly threatened the older students with his father's wrath if they tried to get him into trouble. Violet didn't know who Draco's father even was, but she very strongly did not want to meet him. Fortunately, she wasn't alone in her opinion of Malfoy. Some of the other Slytherin first years had either turned down his offers of friendship or never been offered it in the first place. Theodore Nott was too quiet and bookish to fit in with Malfoy and his thugs. Millicent Bulstrode and Susanna Runcorn hardly spoke to anyone besides each other, and Blaise Zabini didn't speak to much of anyone at all. He liked to sit in the corners of the common room, watching everyone disapprovingly with his dark, narrow eyes. Violet got the feeling he might be just as arrogant as Malfoy himself, only without the need for attention. Gemma Farley, the sixth-year prefect, was one of few who wouldn't put up with Malfoy's threats. "Oh, please tell your father that I dared to shush you at 11 o'clock at night on a bloody Tuesday. I would love to hear back from him, I really would. Go on, write to him. My last name is spelled F-R-L. Violet had also found another ally in the common room, completely by accident. The large boy who'd sat between her and Tracy after the sorting ceremony was third year, called Cassius Warrington. He was taller and lankier than even Ron Weasley, but was too bulky for it to show properly. One evening, while Violet was studying, she got up from her seat to fetch more ink, and came back to find her chair had been literally taken, moved across the room by one of Malfoy's lackeys. Violet stood there, staring angrily at the place where her chair used to be with tears pricking in her eyes, and heard a heavy sigh from behind her. Within a few moments, Warrington had shoved himself out of his own chair and walked across the room, seized the back of Goyle's chair, and tipped him bodily out of it. Malfoy and his gang stared in shock as Warrington dragged the chair back across the room to Violet's table and set it down in front of her. "Found you an empty seat," he said casually, pushing the chair in as she sat down. He smiled at her, glared over at Malfoy, and then went back to his own table. It would be too much to say that Warrington was now her friend, Violet thought, but that didn't stop her from saying good morning and saving him a seat at the table in the great hall. Despite only sharing one class together, Harry complained about Malfoy constantly. Apparently, he had the habit of saying nasty things to Harry when they passed one another in the corridor, which Violet dearly wanted to put a stop to, which would have been easier if she hadn't promised Hagrid to mind her temper. And it wasn't like she could just march up to Malfoy and tell him off in the common room. She had Talavera, after all. Fortunately, an opportunity outside of Professor Snape's classroom presented itself. A notice had been pinned to the board in the Slytherin common room. Flying lessons would be starting on Thursday, and Gryffindor and Slytherin would be learning together. "I can't wait to see how Malfoy actually handles himself on a broom," said Tracy, as the two of them stood in front of the bulletin board. "After all his talk, I'll bet he's actually rubbish at it." Malfoy certainly did talk about flying a lot. He complained loudly about first years, never getting on the house Quidditch teams, and told long, boastful stories that always seemed to end with him narrowly escaping muggles in helicopters. Everyone from wizarding families talked about Quidditch constantly. Tracy apparently had some of her mother's old posters hung up in her bedroom at home, but had never seen a game played in real life. Violet had barely been able to keep up with muggle sports like football, and they only had 'em ball. At 3:30 that afternoon, Violet, Tracy, and the other Slytherins hurried down the front steps onto the ground for their first flying lesson. It was a clear, breezy day, and the grass rippled under their feet as they marched down the sloping lawns toward a smooth, flat lawn on the opposite side of the grounds to the forbidden forest, whose trees were swaying darkly in the distance. 20 broomsticks were lying in neat lines on the ground, though nobody dared touch them just yet. After a few minutes of milling about, the Gryffindors finally joined them, along with their teacher, Madam Hooch, who was one of the most interesting people Violet had ever laid eyes on. She had short grey hair and yellow eyes like a hawk. "Well, what are you all waiting for?" she barked. "Everyone stand by a broomstick. Come on, hurry up." Violet glanced down at her broom. It was rather old, with much of the polish worn off of the handle and some of the twigs sticking out at odd angles. "Stick out your right hand over your broom," called Madam Hooch at the from, "and say, 'Up.'" "Up," everyone shouted. Violet and Harry's brooms jumped into their hands at once, and the twins looked between each other in delight. They were some of the only ones, however. Tracy's broom had simply rolled over on the ground, and Neville Longbottom's hadn't moved at all. Perhaps brooms, like horses, could tell when you were afraid. There was a quaver in Neville's voice that said only too clearly that he wanted to keep his feet on the ground. Madam Hooch then showed them how to mount their brooms without sliding off the end, and walked up and down the rows, correcting their grips. Everyone was delighted when she told Malfoy he'd been doing it wrong for years. "Now, when I blow my whistle, you kick off from the ground, hard," said Madam Hooch. "Keep your broom steady, rise a few feet, and then come straight back down by leaning forward slightly. On my whistle, 3-2, but Neville, nervous and jumpy and frightened of being left on the ground, pushed off hard before the whistle had even touched Madam Hooch's lips. "Come back, boy," she shouted, but Neville was rising straight up like a cork shout out of a bottle 12 feet, 20 feet. Violet saw H.S. scared white face look down at the ground falling away, saw him gasp, slipped sideways off the broom, and wham, a thud and a nasty crack, and Neville lay face down on the grass in a heap. His broomstick was still rising higher and higher, and started to drift lazily toward the forbidden forest and out of sight. Madame Hooch was bending over Neville, her face as white as his. "Broken wrist," Violet heard her mutter. "Come on, boy, it's all right. Up you get." She turned to the rest of the class. "None of you is to move while I take this boy to the hospital wing. You leave those brooms where they are or you'll be out of Hogwarts before you can say Quidditch. Come on, dear." Neville, his face tear-streaked, clutching his wrist, hobbled off with Madame Hooch, who had her arm around him. No sooner were they out of earshot than Malfoy burst into laughter. "Did you see his face, the great lump?" His little group of cronies joined in. "Shut up, Malfoy," snapped a Gryffindor girl, one of the other set of twins that they had been sorted with. "Ooh, sticking up for Longbottom," said Pansy Parkinson, the only girl in Malfoy's clique. "Never thought you'd like fat little crybabies, Parvati." "Look," said Malfoy, darting forward and snatching something out of the grass. "It's that stupid thing Longbottom's gran sent him." A small, clear glass bowl glittered in the sun as he held it up. "Give that here, Malfoy," said Harry's voice, and Violet froze. She could hear the intent in his tone and hoped he wouldn't do anything too stupid. But everyone else had noticed it too and stopped talking to watch the boys. Malfoy smiled nastily. "I think I'll leave it somewhere for Longbottom to find how about up a tree." "Give ither," Harry yelled, but Malfoy had leapt onto his broomstick and taken off. He hadn't been lying, heck could fly well. Hovering level with the topmost branches of an oak, he called, "Come and get it, Potter." Harry grabbed his broom. "No," shouted Hermione Granger. "Madame Hooch told us not to move, you'll get us all in trouble." Harry ignored her. Violet watched her brother mount his broom and kick hard against the ground, and up he soared. He was grinning as the wind ruffled his already mussed-up hair, his robes whipping out behind him. Violet let out a scream of panic as he pulled backward on his broom, fearing that he would slip off and come crashing down just like Neville had, but he only rose higher and turned his broom sharply to face Malfoy. He was flying and doing it well. "Give it here," Harry called, "or I'll knock you off that broom." "Oh, yeah," said Malfoy. Violet grabbed onto Tracy's arm, staring up at Harry without blinking, and screamed again when he suddenly shot forward like a javelin. Malfoy only just got out of the way in time. Harry made a sharp about-face on his broom and held steady. A few people were clapping, but Violet felt as though she might be sick. "No Crab and Goyle up here to save your neck, Malfoy," she heard her brother call, and Malfoy froze. "Catch it if you can, then," Malfoy shouted, and he pulled his arm back and threw the glass ball as hard as he could. Harry streaked after it at once. Violet's vision narrowed to a focused tunnel, blood pounding in her ears. She faintly heard a squawk of alarm followed by a sharp crack, but paid it no mind, so intent she was on making sure her brother didn't fall to his death. Remarkably, Harry wasn't falling to his death at all. He pitched forward on his broom again, and was off like a shot in the direction the ball had been thrown. He let go of the broom with one hand and reached out, grabbing the ball from the air mere feet from the ground, pulling back up just in time to avoid crashing. He toppled gently onto the grass with his hand tucked to his chest, his broom landing softly a few feet away from him. Violet let out a massive breath of relief and felt her entire body relax. "Harry Potter!" Violet didn't even look to see who was shouting. She was already sprinting across the field toward Harry. She helped him to his feet and put her hands on his face, making sure he really was in one piece. Harry's attention was fixed over her shoulder, and she turned to see Professor McGonagall running toward them. Never in all my time at Hogwarts, Professor McGonagall was almost speechless with shock, and her glasses flashed furiously. "Howder, you might have broken your neck," a chorus of voice piped up to defend Harry. "It wasn't his fault, Professor. Be quiet, Miss Patil." "But Malfoy—" "That's enough, Mr. Weasley. Potter, follow me now." There was nothing Violet could do but watch as Harry was led away from the ground by Professor McGonagall, back up the steps and in through the castle doors. As her focus shifted from Harry's disappearing form, Violet saw another small crowd gathered across the field. Draco Malfoy was sitting on the ground, holding a hand to his forehead. Lying several feet from him in the grass were the two halves of his broomstick. "What's happened here?" Madam Hooch demanded, storming back across the field. "What's the matter, boy?" And what? A dozen voices piped up to explain what had went on while she was away, and exactly what part Malfoy had played in it. His pale face grew more and more pink under Madam Hooch's yellow, disapproving gaze. "I've heard enough," Madam Hooch finally said, raising a hand to silence the chorus. "Mr. Malfoy, you've just lost your house 20 points." "20!" cried Pansy. 10 for disregarding my direct instruction, 5 for bullying, 5 for fighting with another student. I'd take another 5 for damaging school property with your unfortunate crash landing if you didn't need a trip to the hospital wing for it." "I didn't crash," Draco said suddenly, meeting Madam Hooch's eyes for the first time. "Crash, fell, whatever you want to call it to save your pride. I didn't fall," he insisted, getting to his feet with difficulty. "The broom broke before I even touched the ground. It was like it just through the crowd of students gathered around him. Malfoy's eyes found Violet. His expression went slack. Snapped. She made Yowat. It was dinner time. Harry had pulled Violet aside as they all bustled into the great hall, grinning broadly, and told her what had happened when he'd left the grounds with Professor McGonagall. "I know, I can't believe it either," he said excitedly. "I don't even know anything about Quidditch, but Wood's going to train me. He's captain of the Gryffindor team, only don't tell anyone yet. I haven't even told Ron." The pair of them got separated by a push of third and fourth years coming through, and Violet was forced to sit through dinner without being able to talk to anyone about all the day's excitement. She was so worried Harry would be expelled and sent back to the Dursleys, and then she really would be all alone. But to hear that he hadn't gotten into trouble at all was spectacular news. Violet kept trying to turn around to look at the Gryffindor table and see how Ron was taking the news, but Tracy kept asking what she was doing. "You're really close with your brother, aren't you?" Tracy said through a mouthful of glazed pheasant. "I don't have any brothers or sisters, so I don't suppose I can relate, but I have about a dozen cousins that live near me, and my dad all muggles, of course, which means I won't be able to tell any of them about school." She looked put out for a moment, but brightened again immediately. "Haven't you got a muggle cousin that lives with you? Are you close too?" "No," said Violet immediately. "No, we're not close at all. He's always picking on us, punching Harry and pulling my hair. Doesn't he get in trouble for it?" Tracy asked, and Violet shook her head. "Our aunt and uncle let him do whatever he wants. Dudley's spoiled rotten. And what about you and Harry? What about us?" "Well, if Dudley's spoiled, how do they treat you too?" Violet blinked at Tracy, trying to decide how to answer. It was a long-standing rule in the Dursley household, as put down by Uncle Vernon when the twins first started attending primary school, not to talk to strangers about what went on in the house. It was a family matter, he'd said, and not anyone's business. If people came around asking questions, Violet and Harry were to tell them that they were being taken care of and leave it at that. Very few people had ever bothered to ask how the twins' home life was, as Uncle Vernon seemed to fear, and the pair of them had always dutifully followed the script they'd been given so that they wouldn't get in trouble at home. Uncle Vernon was a long ways away from her now, but Violet dreaded the thought of coming home for the summer only to be punished. "They take care of us," she told Tracy with a shrug. "We've got our own bedroom, and they brought us to the train station when it was time for school." Tracy was looking at her carefully, in the way that her old teachers sometimes had. It wasn't a look that Violet was particularly fond of, but then again, Violet wasn't fond of people looking at her at all. She reached across the table for a bread roll and took a large bite out of it to try and distract herself. Finally, Tracy relented and went back to her meal. The next time Violet risked a glance over at her brother, it was just in time to see Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle walking away from the Gryffindor table. Violet didn't like that at all. She liked even less when that night in the dormitory, as all the girls were getting ready for bed, Pansy Parkinson approached and gave her a hard shove on the shoulder. "Break anything else today, freak," she spat as Violet whipped around to face her. "What was that for?" demanded Violet. She'd barely spoken 2 words to Pansy, and certainly hadn't done anything to warrant being pushed. Pansy's face was even more pinched than usual as she glared at Violet. "You broke Draco's broom today." "You read the reason he fell and got hurt. He said it snapped right out from under him, and had told us what you did to him on the train." "I didn't do anything to him," Violet said angrily. "He's the one who came in and started bothering us, and you nearly threw him out of the window for it. All I ever did was tell him to get out. How could I have possibly tried to throw him out of a window?" "Because you're a freak," Pansy hissed, pushing Violet again, this time so hard she stumbled back against her trunk. Suddenly, Pansy let out a yelp as something fluffy and purple went sailing through the air and smacked her in the back of the head. "Leave her alone, Parkinson," Tracy said. Glaring in her hand was her other bunny rabbit slipper, poised to be thrown, "or you'll have me to deal with." Pansy spun to look at Tracy with a furious expression on her face. "Oh, that's Rich," she sneered, "the freak and her little half-blood pet." "Stop calling me that," Violet yelled. "I'm not a freak." "Two, what else could you be, Potter?" "Normal people can't break things with their mind. You know that's something freaks do," Pansy yelped again as Tracy's other slipper hit her square in the ear. She grabbed the side of her face and glared daggers at them both. Her face had gone all red and blotchy. "I'm telling," she threatened. "I'll tell Snape you attacked me, and you'll both get thrown out for good. Go to bed and leave us alone, or next time it'll be a proper shoe," said Tracy, walking around the beds to come and stand beside Violet. Violet, on reflex, reached down and grabbed Tracy's hand and squeezed. Together they presented a united front, and Pansy had no choice but to retreat. She stomped back to her bed on the other side of the room and climbed inside, yanking the heavy silk curtains shut around her so she didn't have to look at them anymore. Violet sat down heavily on her own bed and tried not to cry. "What abbage?" Tracy grumbled, then immediately gasped and clapped both hands over her mouth. "Oh no, I didn't say that." "Promise you didn't hear me say that." Violet smiled at her, best she could. "Say what?" Tracy stared at her, wide-eyed, and then began to giggle behind her hands. That night Violet went to bed feeling something she had rarely felt before, and certainly never felt without Harry beside her safe. She felt protected, knowing that there was somebody else in the room willing to fight for her, to stand up for her, and stand next to her in the face of trouble. Tracy was a good friend. Somehow Violet would have been brave enough to be a good friend for her too. The next morning Pansy's curtains were still pulled tightly shut, and she didn't leave the dormitory until everyone else had already exited into the common room. She did not, as Violet had privately feared, she would go and tell Professor Snape about the incident the night before. It seemed that Pansy's bark was much worse than her bite. As the owls flooded into the great hall as usual, everyone's attention was caught at once by a long, thin package carried by 6 large screech owls. Violet watched, along with everyone else, to see where this large parcel would land, and was amazed when the owls soared down and dropped it right in front of Harry. Another, much smaller owl fluttered behind them and dropped a letter into his lap. As he started to tear into the envelope, Violet was already on her feet and crossing the hall. "Blimey!" exclaimed Ron, startled, as Violet suddenly appeared behind him and Harry and peered over her brother's shoulder at the letter. She recognized the handwriting at once. "Do not open the parcel at the table. It contains your new Nimbus 2000, but I don't want everybody knowing you've got a broomstick, or they'll all want one. Oliver Wood will meet you tonight on the Quidditch field at 7 o'clock for your first training sessions. Professor M." "McGonagall, Harry, that's brilliant," Violet him, hugging him round the shoulders as he passed the letter over for Ron to read. "A Nimbus 2000, Ron moaned enviously. "I've never a Venticheddon." "Let's go unwrap it," Harry said, clambering to his feet. He stopped. "Wait, Violet, you can't come in the Gryffindor common room. You can show me later," Violet told him, still beaming. His face lit up again. Yeah, I will. Come to practice with me after dinner. You can try it out, too, if you want. For the rest of the day, Violet struggled to stay focused on her lessons. Her mind kept wandering to that evening's plans and Harry's new racing broom. Surely he had it tucked away in his dormitory somewhere. Harry had never really owned anything that was just this before. Everything they had at the Dursleys was either shared between them or didn't really belong to them at all, and they were merely borrowing it from their aunt and uncle. Violet had accumulated a few things for herself since coming to Hogwarts, mainly Crookshanks, but it was wonderful to hear that her brother would finally be getting something all to himself. As dinner was ending, Violet watched Harry and Ron bolt out of the great hall as soon as they were allowed and head up the grand marble staircase. Violet lingered at the table a while longer, nibbling at the scraps left on her plate, before finally making an excuse to Tracy and heading out for herself. Violet had never been inside of the Quidditch pitch before. It was a large oval field with hundreds of seats raised in stands around the outside. At either end of the field were 3 golden poles with hoops on the end. They reminded Violet of the little plastic sticks Muggle children blew bubbles through, except they were 50 feet tall. The sun was just starting to set as she stepped onto the field, but there was plenty of light left for her to be able to see Harry already in the air, zipping about and weaving between the poles on his brand new broomstick. "Let me have a go," she called up to him. Harry whipped around on his broom and waved. Suddenly, he was diving toward her and gaining speed, heading straight in her direction so fast Violet thought she might not be able to move in time. But then Harry pulled back on his broom and slowed way down, making several slow loops around her before finally touching down. His hair was windswept and his face was flushed pink, but he looked happier than Violet had ever seen him. "You made it," Harry said excitedly. "Sorry, I couldn't wait to see how it handled." "It's beautiful." Violet stared in wonder as Harry passed the broom over to her. Sleek and shiny, with a mahogany handle, it had a long tail of neat, straight twigs and Nimbus 2000 written in gold near the top. Even Violet, who knew nothing about the different brooms, though that it looked very finely made indeed. "Go on," said Harry, releasing the broom to her entirely. "Give it a shot." With a nervous grin, Violet mounted the broomstick and kicked off from the ground just the way that Madame Hooch had taught them. She hovered for a moment, getting a feel for it. It wasn't nearly as unsteady as she'd imagined it would be before pulling back and allowing herself to rise a few feet at first, then a few more, then even higher until she was hovering 20 feet above the field and staring down at Harry's joyous face beneath her. The wind whipped her hair about her face, and from this height Violet could see out over the treetops of the forbidden forest. The sun had just vanished beneath the horizon. "Don't just sit there," Harry hollowed up at her. "Fly," and Violet flew. She did a lap around the stadium once at a slower pace, just to get a feel for the broom, and then, once felt comfortable, she took her second lap as fast as she dared push herself. By the time Violet slowed and pulled to a stop, she looked down to see another boy standing there beside Harry, watching her. A large chest was on the ground between them. They both waved as she approached. Eyes watering and face chapped from the wind, Violet landed softly in front of them and passed the broom back over to Harry. "Blimey, it must run in the family," said the other boy, whom Violet could now see was much older than either of them. He was grinning as he shook her hand. "Oliver Wood, captain of the Gryffindor Quidditch team. If you weren't a Slytherin, I'd encourage you to join the team yourself. Flying like that, you could make a fair chaser." Violet didn't know what a chaser was, but glowed under the compliment. Wood's smile turned awkward. "Speaking of Slytherin, I know you're Harry's sister and all, but we're supposed to keep this sort of training under wraps until the first match. Catch everyone by surprise and all, throw them their game. Not to be rude, but You want me to leave?" Violet said matter-of-factly, even as her heart sank. "It's nothing personal, if that helps, and if you don't mention any of this to the folks in your house." Flint'll use any advantage he has. The bastard Sorry and I wouldn't be surprised if that meant giving you a hard time for information. Can't have that, can we?" "Who's Flint?" Harry asked, frowning. "Slytherin team captain. Looks a bit like a troll." Violet knew immediately who he was talking about. She'd seen him lounging around the common room with some other older boys, grunting and laughing with them. "But that's not fair," protested Harry. "Never spy for Slytherin. She's not like the other ones." Like Malfoy, I mean," he said, as Violet had turned to look at him strangely. "There are plenty of nice people in Slytherin, Harry," she said. Harry grimaced. "Well, there's you, at least." "I still don't know how you got stuck there, Romans 6. You're not. I didn't get stuck there. I was sorted," said Violet, indignant. "The hat said it was the best place for me to be, even though I wanted to be with you. But you could have said no to it. It wanted to put me in Slytherin too, but I told it I'd rather be anywhere, but there I didn't want. Be a dark wizard." Violet reeled back as though she'd been hit. She could feel the hurt and anger mingling in her belly, directed toward her twin for the very first time. It was a sour feeling. "Is that what you think of us?" she asked Harry, taking a step away from him and Wood. "Is that what you think of me now?" Harry's face flushed slightly. She could tell he was going to try and backpedal, to half-heartedly apologize for hurting her feelings while still standing by his opinions, and Violet didn't want to hear it at all. She put up a hand and took another step away from them, and then another, and just kept on walking out of the Quidditch pitch, even as Harry tried to call her back. There were tears in her eyes by the time she reached the castle, real, proper tears sliding down her cheeks and dripping off of her chin. They never fought. Never in their lives had she and Harry turned their anger on one another or hurt each other's feelings. There were enough people in the world to do that to them already. They didn't have time to fight or hold grudges. But this felt like a fight, and that didn't feel good at all. How could Harry think that about her? Did he really believe that she was evil or a dark witch in training, just because of the house she was sorted into? All those things they'd heard on the train from Ron and from Hagrid about Slytherin being the only Hogwarts house to have bad wizards coming out of it all flooded back to Violet, only driving her to cry harder. What had the Sorting Hat seen in her that made it think she would do well in a house with such a nasty reputation? How could she have anything in common with people like Malfoy or Crabbe or Goyle? Or so wrapped up was Violet in her anger and grief that she barely paid attention to where she was going. She took the steps down to the dungeons 2 at a time, and on her way down the corridor, she very nearly ran straight into someone walking in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, that someone was Professor Snape. "Watch where you're going, Potter," he snapped, stepping to the side as Violet drew up short. He stopped and stared at her, eyes narrowing at the tears on her cheeks. "What's happened to you? Are you hurt?" Violet quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her robes and shook her head. "No, sir." "Sorry, I wasn't looking where I was going. Sorry." Snape squinted suspiciously at her. "If you need to be escorted to the hospital wing, I'm really fine," said Violet loudly, her small voice echoing off the stone walls around them. I just want to go inside, please." For a moment, Violet was worried Snape would be angry with her and take points for shouting, or for being out of the common room after dark, or even just because he felt like it. But after another long moment of staring at her, he sniffed dismissively and started to walk away. Violet stood for a moment and then, "Sir," Snape's footsteps stopped. When she turned around, he was looking at her impatiently. Violet considered for a moment. "Are we bad people?" she asked softly. "Slytherins, I mean. I don't feel level. I don't want to be bad or hurt anyone, but the way people talk about us. Do we get any say in who we are?" Snape was staring at her, his brow deeply furrowed. Violet felt as though he were almost looking through her. A minute passed before he opened his mouth and looked as though he meant to say something profound, or perhaps even kind. He closed his mouth and returned his focus to her. The moment passed. "Go to bed, Miss Potter," he told her quietly, and then turned on his heel and walked away.